All right, so today we're going to start Hinduism. And the first thing out the chute I want to tell you is Hinduism is a made up word, I believe, coined in the 19th century during the English or British colonialism of the subcontinent of India. And there were all these existing traditions within India at that time, but the British just wanted to have like an overarching category in which to put all these other religions. And so they coined this term Hinduism. And I've noticed on some of my Hinduism lectures in the past, I have Hindus come in or people practicing the Vedic traditions, and they're very adamant about Hinduism is not a religion, et cetera, et cetera. And I get that, and I just want to acknowledge that right up. It's a useful umbrella term, but there is no like Hinduism per se. And what we're going to be discussing is some of the Vedic traditions. And the Vedas are the scriptures of what we're going to call Hinduism. And before I get into that, I want to read you a brief story called The Brahman and the Pit. And this came from one of the books I've used over the years called The Ways of Religion. And I really like this book because it gives you like first-person accounts of practitioners within various religious traditions. So you're not getting like a secular humanist view of religion. You're not getting like a Christian view of other religions, but each religion is getting to speak from its own voice, its own representatives. And I love this story. And who knows, by the time we get to the end of this section on Hinduism, maybe you'll understand its meaning. And I don't know that I fully understand its meaning at this time, but here we go. This is called The Brahman and the Pit. Oh, and a Brahman is like the highest caste in Hinduism. This is where you would find nobles, scholars, philosophers, theologians, religious leaders. And so this is the high caste of Hinduism. And I'll talk about the caste system later on. But this is called The Brahman and the Pit. A certain Brahman who lived in this world wandered into a deep, dark forest that was filled with ferocious wild beasts. Okay. The forest was populated with lions, bull elephants, and other animals that roared incessantly. It was so terrifying that even the god of death, Yama, would cringe at entering into this malevolent realm. Realizing he was lost, the Brahmin became very alarmed and began to run around in circles, hoping to find his way out. Attempting to elude the frightening creatures which were all around, the panicked man ran deeper and deeper into the forest. Still, he could not rid himself of his pursuers. The Brahmin looked up and saw that the forest was surrounded by a net, held by a huge woman with outstretched arms. Ooh. Okay. Serpents with 5 heads also encompassed the forest and were so tall their heads reached nearly up to the heavens. In a clearing there was a deep pit covered with creeping vines and underbrush. As the Brahmin ran frantically through the forest, pursued by a wild elephant, he stumbled into the open pit and became lodged halfway down the hole in the vines that grew over it. As the Brahmin hung upside down, tangled in the vines, he saw a huge serpent at the bottom of the hole. Looking up, he saw an elephant at the top of the hole. The dark-skinned elephant had 6 faces and 12 feet and seemed intent on maintaining its vigil at the mouth of the hole. In the vines that held the Brahmin, bees had built hives filled with honey. These hives dripped honey near him, and he reached out to catch the sweet nectar in his mouth as he hung there. The more honey the Brahmin ate, the more he wanted. His thirst could not be quenched. Meanwhile, black and white rats gnawed at the roots of the vines which held him. With elephant above, serpent below, bees buzzing all around, and rats gnawing at his life support, the Brahmin continued to reach out for more honey. Okay, so that's called The Brahman in the Pit. And I just love the imagery there. And it's very symbolic. It's obviously an allegory or metaphor, talking about the many trials and temptations in this life, but also pointing to like the underlying reality of all things. And we will get to that. There's one more passage I want to share with you before I start teaching on Hinduism. And this comes from the one of the later Vedas called the Upanishads. And I believe these were written around 700 AD. And this is the book that completely changed my view on Hinduism. When I was a young boy being brought up Baptist fundamentalist, we would often have missionaries come and speak in our church from different places around the world. And I'll never forget, we had a few come from India, and the stories they told were just so incredulous to me as a young boy, because they talked about these temples and these idols and how people were actually worshiping like golden or idols carved out of stone, or even sometimes they would worship rivers or trees or animals. And as a young boy, I just thought, how ignorant. I mean, I already had been reading through the Old Testament, and it reminded me so much of the stories of when the children of Israel came into Canaan. And you had all these polytheistic cultures and idol worshipers, and how God was so vehemently opposed to this and wanted those other idols and groves destroyed and removed. He didn't want it influencing the people. And so as a young man hearing these accounts, I just thought, wow, this is just like the Old Testament. But how ignorant for people to worship wood, metal, stone, rivers instead of the one that created all things. But when I read as a young man the Upanishads, I had kind of had a falling out with my Christian upbringing, and I thought it was only fair to give the other religions of the world a check out and see if maybe they held the truth. And one of my favorite all-time movies is called The Razor's Edge. It's based on a Somerset Maugham book about a young man shortly around, I think, in between the world wars, is trying to find meaning in life, and he ends up going to India. And it was during his time as like a coal miner, he was living this existential life. Someone mentioned this book to him, and he asked him, this coal miner asked this young man seeking enlightenment, have you ever been to India? And the young man kind of skeptically goes, no, what's in India? And he says, oh, nothing, just a billion people that pray 5 times a day or 3 times a day. And I have a wonderful coffee table book about the religions of India, and it's titled Where Every Prayer is a Breath. And it really began to affect me. Just this very different approach, this very inclusive, holistic approach to spirituality. Because in the East, we don't have this same dualism that we have in the West between the sacred and the secular, between the holy and the profane. But if you're starting with this presupposition that all is God, well, then everything is holy, right? Everything can become a sacrament. And I actually coined this term. I don't know if anyone else has ever used it, but part of how I was affected by studying Hinduism and pantheism is I like to call myself a pan-sacramentalist now. Now, the tradition I was brought up in, we had 2 sacraments, baptism and communion, or the Lord's Supper. If you're raised Roman Catholic, you have 7 sacraments. But what I began to realize by studying these Eastern religions, that everything, every single activity in my life could actually be a sacrament. And if you're familiar with what a sacrament is, it's a means by which we receive God's grace. And so it's not just through communion or baptism that I receive God's grace, but my morning cup of coffee can be a sacrament. My morning shower can be a sacrament. When I'm driving in my car or teaching in my classroom, it can be a means by which God is bringing his grace into me, and I am a conduit in distributing that grace to others. And so I really like, and I'm not trying to disparage you if you're Roman Catholic or Baptist or a Protestant, and I'm not trying to diminish or take away from your sacraments. And I too think they're very important. But what I've come to realize is the means of God's grace into my life is not limited to just a prescribed set of elements or rituals, but it can be accomplished by watching a sunrise to changing a baby's diaper. It could be a sacramental grace-giving means to me and an outflow of God's grace to others. And so I want to read you a section from the Upanishads, which changed my view from Hinduism being an ignorant, primitive religion, primitive in the negative sense of the word, to one that was quite profound. And actually, and I'm not even playing right now, I actually believe Hinduism is the most logical of all the world religions. And you can approach it through human reason and understanding. And this is an interesting distinction I want to make between the religions of the East and the religions of the West. There is no concept of sin in the East. What you have is ignorance. And the cure for ignorance is knowledge. And so that's why we talk about not people in the East being saved by a variety of Hindu deities, or Buddhists don't talk about being born again or being saved. They talk about being or becoming enlightened. And this enlightenment comes through knowledge and understanding. And that is how they believe ultimately they will achieve union with the Godhead, with the divine. And so knowledge over ignorance. And I want to start with this passage. And I'd be happy later to demonstrate this to you, why Hinduism is so incredibly logical. And if you're a Christian or a Jew or a Muslim, you can be offended if you want, but all of those religions require a tremendous amount of faith to believe. Hinduism does not require faith. It is based on reason and their understanding of how they believe the world is. And so let me read you this section from the Upanishads. And I'm sorry if there's any Hindi speakers out there or Sanskrit speakers. If I butcher these names, I'm not doing it on purpose. It's just out of my own ignorance. And I'll do my best. This is from the Chandogya Upanishad. When Savatiku was 12 years old, his father, Udalaka, said to him, Savatikatu, you must now go to school and study. None of our family, my child, is ignorant of Brahman. And in this sense, Brahman is this high name of God. And I'll talk about different aspects of the godhood later, but this is who they're referring to, this high concept of God in the Hindu tradition. Thereupon, Savatiku went to a teacher and studied for 12 years. After committing to memory all the Vedas, that would be like memorizing the Old Testament, he returned home full of pride in his learning. His father noticed the young man's conceit and said to him, Savatiku, have you asked for that knowledge by which we hear the unhearable, by which we perceive the unperceivable, and by which we know the unknowable? What knowledge is that, sir? Asked Savatiku. My child, as by knowing one lump of clay, all things made of clay are known, the difference being only in name and arising from speech. And the truth being that all are gold. Oh, the same for knowing a nugget of gold. All things made of gold are known, the difference being only in name and arising from speech. And the truth being that all are gold. Exactly so is that knowledge, knowing which we know all. But surely those venerable teachers of mine are ignorant of this knowledge, for if they had possessed it, they would have taught it to me. Do you therefore, sir, give me that knowledge? Be it so, said Udalaka, and continued thus. As the bees make honey by gathering juices from many flowers, plants, and trees, and as these juices reduced to one honey do not know from what flower they came from, in the same way, my son, all creatures, when they are merged in that one existence, whether in dreamless sleep or in death, know nothing of their past or present state, because of the ignorance enveloping them. Know not that they are merged in him, and that from him they come. Whatsoever these creatures are, whether a lion, a tiger, or a boar, or a worm, or a gnat, or a mosquito, that they remain after they come back from dreamless sleep. All these have their self in him alone. He is the truth. He is the subtle essence of all. He is the self, and that, Savatiku, thou art that. Please, sir, tell me more about this self. Be it so, my son. The rivers in the east flow eastward, the rivers in the west flow westward, and all enter into the sea. From sea to sea they passed, the clouds lifting them to the sky as vapor and sending them down as rain. And as these rivers, when they are united with the sea, do not know whether they are this or that river, likewise all those creatures that I have named, when they have come back from Brahman, know not whence they came. All of these beings have their self in him alone. He is the truth. He is the subtle essence of all. And that, Sevatikatu, thou art that. Please, sir, tell me more about this self. Be it so, my child. Bring a fruit of the Nigroda tree. Here it is, sir. Break it. It is broken, sir. What do you see? Some seeds extremely small, sir. Break one of them. It is broken, sir. What do you see? Nothing, sir. The subtle essence you do not see, and in that is the whole of the Nigroda tree. Believe, my son, that that which is the subtle essence, in that have all things their existence, that is the truth, that is the self, and that, Sivatikatu, thou art that. Please, sir, tell me more about this self. Be it so. Put this salt in water and come to me tomorrow morning. Satekatu did as he was bidden. The next morning his father asked him to bring the salt, which he had put into the water, but he could not, for it had dissolved. Then said Uddalaka, sip the water and tell me how it tastes. It is salty, sir. In the same way, continued Uddalaka, though you do not see Brahman in this body, he is indeed here. That which is a subtle essence, and that have all things their existence, that is the truth, that is the self, and that, Sevatikatu, thou art that. And holy cow, that's way different from some ignorant peasant worshiping an idol made of wood or stone or casting flowers into the river or something like that. This is a very high conception of God, that he is the source of all things, and from all things come from him, and to him all things will return. And in other passages of the Upanishads, they talk about how there really is no distinction from the fire and the wood being burned. Both are part of the same thing. There is no difference between the killer and the killed. Both are the same person. And I'm just like, holy cow, this is really, really getting intense. This is very different than my understanding of Hinduism before. And if you can hold in your mind that thought that all is one, that will help you get into this Hindu way of thinking and mindset. All right. Before we get into more of the deeper mysteries of Hinduism, I thought I would give you just like a little background of like the history of Hinduism, where it emerged, how it emerged, and some of those backgrounds. And so Hinduism, the real goal here is absorption into Brahman or into God, re-emerging, becoming one with God. But you have to take this as a figure of speech, because in reality, no one is separated from Brahman. Brahman is all, and in all, and all are in Brahman. So it's not like Brahman can be here and you're over here somewhere, because Brahman is the totality of reality. So all things must be in Brahman. There is no outside of Brahman. Brahman is the totality of reality. Well, this way of thinking, as far as I can understand from history, was brought to India by the Aryan tribes. And these are the same sorts of people. These are like Germanic people. So like when you hear today, like the Aryan nation or white supremacists, it's those same type of Aryans we're talking about. And these were like Caucasian people, probably coming from the Caucasus, migrating into northern India and displacing the indigenous people there, or conquering and then ruling over them. Now, the Aryans were a polytheistic culture. They believed in many gods, just like the Greco-Roman pantheons, they had gods of war, gods of fertility, gods of beauty, gods of agriculture, different deities for all these different things. In fact, I believe their name for their god of war was Indra. And India itself is named after that deity, the god of war, India from Indra. A big part of that came with this thinking was this idea of reincarnation, karma, and dharma. Now, karma is very akin to the Christian principle of you reap what you sow. If you're kind, generous, grateful, those things will come back to you. If you're self-serving, violent, ignorant, those things will come back to you. And so it's kind of like this you reap what you sow principle. As far as I understand, in the Hindu traditions, karma is always seen as a negative, but in the West, we talk about good karma and bad karma, which I think is appropriate. I mean, whether you're reaping good deeds or bad deeds would result in that designation. Another term I want you to know is called dharma. And dharma would be the reason you're here in life. We all have a different dharma, a different purpose, a different role that we are expected to perform. And if we successfully perform our dharma, why we were put here, and we avoid bad karma that everyone has to pay for themselves, no one else can pay your karmic debt for you. So if you fulfill your dharma, avoid bad karma, then when you die, you will be reincarnated into a more positive place and position. And so this concept of reincarnation is that Brahman, and I wish I had my whiteboard, but once again, I'll try to demonstrate this visually with my hands and with my words. So if Brahman is the totality of reality, let's use the water analogy that we had in the Upanishads. He talked about when different rivers flow into the sea, they no longer remember what river they were because they are now all one in the ocean. And the ocean is a great metaphor for this, for this concept of Brahman, or the idea of water. Water is one, whether it's in the ocean, whether it's in the clouds, whether it's in snow or rain, whether it's in creeklets or ponds or lakes or rivers and streams, and then it's returned back to the ocean. Water is one in that cycle, whether from the sea to the sky to flowing back to its home in the sea. And Brahman would be representative of like this sea, but even more so, he would be the totality of all water in all its forms. And so Brahman cast himself into this world of samsara. And samsara means the world of illusion, the world of temporal, physical, material things. And I don't know why Brahman does this. I don't know if God gets bored and this is a way to play like an eternal game of cosmic hide and seek with himself. But when Brahman enters into the world of illusion, of samsara, of space-time, he forgets who he was. And he may enter into the world as perhaps an amoeba. And that amoeba is going to have a dharma, a purpose to its life, which may simply be to replicate, to divide and multiply. And if it does that, when the amoeba dies, then in its next life, it will reincarnate into perhaps a higher life form or a different life form. But if that amoeba has racked up bad karma, in its next life, it is going to have to deal with that bad karma. So you basically are picking up where you left off. If you ever saw that Bill Murray movie, Groundhog Day, it's like Hinduism compressed into a 24-hour period. And do you remember what Bill Murray had to do before he could go to his next day? Before he could get out of that loop? I'll tell you, he had to have a perfect day. He did everything right. He finally, and who knows how long he had been going through that day. He learned to play piano. He learned Italian. He learned all these different sorts of things, which would have taken years to have mastered. But finally, on one particular day, he did everything right he was supposed to. And the next morning, he woke up and it was another day. Well, imagine that now for a lifetime, that until you fulfill that, what you were supposed to do in that lifetime, you don't get to go on to that next level or that next step. Okay, so back to this analogy of Brahman putting himself or a part of his consciousness or being into this world of illusion. And so say he starts as an amoeba and then he fulfills his duty, his dharma as an amoeba. His next life, perhaps he gets to come back as maybe an ant. Well, he comes back as a worker ant and he does the worker ant stuff. He's a good worker ant. He dies and comes back as a worker ant for a few lifetimes. And then maybe he gets to come back as like a soldier ant. But in one of his soldier ant lifetimes, he messes up and the hive gets slaughtered and the queen gets taken captive and he was basically a failure. So now maybe his next life when he dies, he doesn't even get to come back as a soldier ant, but he has to go back and be a worker ant again. And he has to keep doing that until he gets the worker ant thing down right. Then maybe he gets to come back as a drone or a queen. And then once he succeeds in fulfilling his dharma as an ant, maybe he gets to come back as like a caterpillar or a butterfly. And if he does that transformation correctly and fulfills his dharma, his next life, maybe he gets to come back as like a rodent or a mammal. And then if that is fulfilled, maybe he gets to come back as like maybe a predator or something higher up on the food chain. Hindus talk about 10,000 reincarnations, and it's a figure of speech, but it means a lot. When Brahman puts his consciousness into this world of illusion, it could go through this cycle of 10,000 iterations before you even get to be a human being. And by the way, congratulations to all of you on this Zoom or video watching. You are coming down the home stretch because you have been reincarnated as humans this time around. Now, there still could be hundreds, if not thousands, of reincarnations involving your human state of being, but you are coming down that home stretch, and the hope and the goal is self-realization. And what you're trying to realize about the self is you are that God who created all things, and your consciousness is in this human iteration. And once you realize who you actually are, at that point, you can get off the wheel of illusion. And just like a raindrop is cast into the mountains and makes its way through lots of different transformations, different creeks, rivers, lakes, reservoirs, rivers, all the way down to the stream, we are all in this journey and process through different reincarnations until we realize who we are and return back to our true selves as Brahman. Okay, so that's the concept of reincarnation in a nutshell. And so think of the water analogy. It's all one. Water's all one, whether it's in the ocean or a water droplet, a raindrop. But Brahman, like the sea, everything comes from him, but everything returns to him. When we are in him, we only know who we are in him, but he has manifested himself in countless forms through all the different life and movement we see throughout the cosmos. Any questions or comments on that? Okay. I briefly alluded to this idea of liberation versus salvation. And once again, let me reiterate this. For the Hindu, it's not about sin or falling morally short of a perfect God. There's no deity up there judging us and critiquing us and evaluating us, and that's going to punish us or reward us based on our behavior. In Hinduism, it's actually God almost like a God with amnesia traveling through these different incarnations until he comes to this point where he remembers or realizes, that's why it's called self-realization, who he actually is. And once that takes place, enlightenment occurs, and you can choose to get off the wheel of illusion or not. In the East, we see it much differently, like where God gives us this righteous, and if we can't live up to it, we're considered sinful or evil. And the God in the Western traditions has to make provision for people falling short of his commands. Where in the East, it's simply this process or this journey, and there's long paths and there's short paths. Some people realize their Godhead quickly. For some, it takes reincarnation after reincarnation after reincarnation. And I think we're out of time today, but we'll pick up on Wednesday on 3 of the different paths of liberation.